Hey y'all there, virtual adventurers, how are you doing? Thanks for clicking in and welcome. We're doing some adventuring today in a wintry survival game called Northern Lights. I woke up the other day with an email in my inbox inviting me to play this title, which oddly Steam has never recommended to me, despite that I play so many others that are similar. But after browsing some information about it, I figured that this would actually fit right in with the regular theme. So I'm going to get through a few story locations and walk through some of the basic survival tips from what I could learn from me stumbling through this. The more I read about the game, the more interesting it seemed in the survival mechanics that it utilizes, and I'm not personally used to having sanity added to the bars to pay attention to. Apparently cabin fever is also a factor, and it immediately makes me reference these studies about what happens to your brain if you're a researcher living in the cold for too long. It's actually fascinating, and I'll elaborate more on that later in the video. It is currently available with a couple of modes. One is for story, and the other one a little bit of an aimless survival mode. There's a multiplayer option that'll be coming in the future, according to a developer's post about the 2022 roadmap. Pretty neat that there's even a custom mode that lets players toggle through difficulty levels for each major gameplay aspect, including how bad the weather can get on us. I'm going to go ahead and take it easy on the Wanderer selection for the story progress just to get started, but eventually I want to see how anxiety-inducing this game can get to give y'all a fair assessment.
Oh, my head. What just happened?
No real intro going on here, just dropped right into this very blindingly white, snowy world that can change drastically with weather and time. A handful of lines are delivered by a voice actor with subtitles at the bottom of the screen for those who are playing on silent. There's a wrecked helicopter behind us with nothing in it, but we're prompted by the markers to follow a trail of blood through the snow. Immediately all around us are a bunch of gatherable items. Not much of that is important at this time, so go ahead and follow the quest's literal trail that winds upward to a cave that's lit with a green glow stick. Inside, you'll find the unfortunate fate of your buddy before we continue on through the cave to the other side, in which you'll get one of the game's lovely tutorial prompts provided to briefly explain the features or hazards that we'll encounter. At this point, we're told about the binoculars for scouting the zones for places that might be worth exploring. To activate these, hit the V key and pan around the view. It's going to lock onto a location ahead that requires careful climbing down the small cliffside. I don't want to get injured here, or it already sets off one of your many potentialities for a game mechanic called Afflictions. Early quest progress, we find a small outpost with an unrecoverable electrical system that's damaged beyond repair, but we can find a scrap of map that previews our next quest objectives so that we have an idea where to go next. There are limited supplies located in the crates that will stave off your hunger. This probably won't be much of a concern at this point, but just to let you know, we cannot sprint when our backpack is overloaded. When the kilogram meter is in the red, we'll be remanded to walking speed, even if it all fits in space-wise. Two quick command tools that you will already have on hand at the beginning of the game are your watch and compass. The compass can be viewed by holding down the C key. The colors marked on the compass line up with the one on the map to indicate your direction. If you run around for a bit, occasionally looking at it, you can eventually get a feel for how it navigates you in relation to the map. The second tool is the watch, which includes indicators for several of your health bars. Holding the T key raises your wrist to view it, and then clicking through the right button cycles through the information the watch contains. The first screen is time, second screen has bars for hunger, thirst, and temperature, and the third screen is outside temperature and wind chill. But let's talk about all of the meters that we've got to keep in mind to manage all of these stats. First, there's the health bar, and it's the very first tooltip part of the tutorial that will pop up as the most relevant overall indicator of your health stats. It's also the most important, or its death is a consequence of running it down to nothing. It starts to tick away as other stats aren't kept in check. Hunger is straightforward and a common indicator for survival games. Fairly self-explanatory on how to solve this one. The only complication comes in finding safe items to eat. Thirst is another usual suspect for any survival game. Moderate amounts of thirst are restored when consuming select foods, but when using the cookpot over a fire, snow can be melted and consumed just by itself to restore both thirst and warmth. Temperature, it's easy to get the concept, but the beginner's solution for this until finding improved clothing by exploring abandoned sites is to craft a stick fire and hang out close enough to it in order to keep temperature in a reasonable range. Energy and stamina sprint mechanics are intertwined. As the main energy level falls, so will the meter that times the player's ability to sprint before needing to stop for regeneration. Energy can be restored quite quickly through beds found in abandoned areas or by crafting a bed from the tab menu, but you'll also pick up a little here and there through food. Now, Sanity is a rather interesting mechanic here, triggered by unpleasant experiences, afflictions that can be acquired with environmental effects or injuries. When not attended to, the player can spiral into psychosis-like state that includes hallucinations. Cabin fever comes in hard mode options for gameplay. It adds to the threat of being indoors for too long. Even if there's also harsh weather outside, this will keep you dancing in between if you don't feel like every other threat in the game is enough to deal with already. Afflictions are injuries or illnesses that one can acquire while traversing Northern Lights' harsh landscape. If you've gotten one, a prompt for the Q menu will show up in the bottom left above your stats. When the key is pressed, it will show the risk to the player and how severe they're getting. This can help you keep a constant check on what might start lowering your health meter. That is the one that you really have to start worrying about and making sure that it's not falling. We have a small section in our inventory backpack that's just specifically for medical supplies, both medications and bandages, which can be crafted in the menu from scraps of cloth found about areas where humans once existed. Look-arounds for curtains, pillows, carpets, and other fabric items to shred for even more cloth. Pine sap that can be found along broken trees, combined with the cloth bandages, provide extra protection against infection. Other potential hazards exist, like poisoning. The plants and fungus gathered from around the woods may or may not be safe for consumption. Once you pick up the plant, it will now show up in the menu's guidebook, but it's not immediately known why this might be useful, or if it should just be avoided. This game has actually got a whole lot going on. This guidebook serves as a general UI for all crafting and exploration information. There are tabs to look up plants, your skills, and their levels, or tell you more about the affliction you probably just acquired. The last tab on the left is for notes that we collect through finding story locations. So far I've scrapped up a couple, and I really don't have much of a clue what's happening yet. The entire right side is different menus for crafting survival gear. This first one is our tools and components, which includes daggers, hatchets, and ropes to make them, among other weapons like the spear, bow, and arrows to accompany it. The next tab is a fire crafting section. Starts us out in the very simple stick fire and progresses from there as we level up fire making and skill department. The third is traps, which provides a variety of devices to catch animals. Our fourth tab down is for bedding and housing, giving us only a stick bed at the beginning, but it's still incredibly useful for saving your game on the fly with the cost of only 12 sticks that can usually be found wherever you are. It also acts to restore energy. Just mind the other stats, which can decrease while you sleep. The fifth tab contains more craftables. Many of these involve storage of different gatherable materials along with the general storage chest. Points of interest to investigate populate a question mark on the map when you walk near one. Many will have at least some bonus loot, so it's worth looking around. It's more bad news coming across the weather station on this island that you're assigned to. Everyone is expired. Perhaps under some strange circumstances. Clues will lead you around to what you're supposed to do. It's not too difficult to figure out after running about grabbing all the items on the shelf. Plenty of food that doesn't spoil, useful tools, and more. There's also beds in the back room to catch a moment of shut-eye and save. By this time, you've likely already spotted the snowmobile that will become an integral part of our success to traveling around, but it requires some subsequent questing in this zone's points of interest to find both keys and a fuel source to get it started. Notes about both get written in the section of our guidebook and can be tracked by selecting the specific quests that you want to do from the menu. What will also be in that book is any of these notes that you've been clicking on throughout exploring. Among the first also attached a key I fetched for this quest. Helps to keep track of progress along with the active log. There's something about catastrophic weather patterns immediately in the notes, and it's quite apparent that the weather in the area can get extreme, making for uncomfortable survival times. Once we've activated the computers inside the weather station, we realize no reports have been made since whatever took place there, so we climb for the hills to make the report ourselves. But it's to no avail. There's nothing but static. Which means we're on our own here, and we're gonna have to find our own way out. We better get to walking then. Along many sites, players will find books that can be read rather than harvested for paper debris. These books open up a research window that acts similar to the screen for sleeping. Our energy is drained the longer that we research, but there's rewards that come from waiting for that bar to get to 100%. From what I can tell, so far it may help us figure out what out in the wilderness is safe to consume or use as medicines, and unlocks some blueprints in the crafting menu, so look around for those books. The environment in Northern Lights does change a lot from moment to moment, even if the landscape pretty much resembles just snow and stone. The massive weather shifts go from bright and colorful skies full of puffy clouds to nearly no visibility with flurries of snow and tree branches lashing you in the face from the violent winds. And it can all happen within a matter of minutes, far from any established structures. The environment in the game can be very unfriendly to say the least, but this is a survival game with that lovely custom adjustable mode if you really prefer more vacation-like snow weather. However, this isn't much of a vacation snacking on grounded birds. Getting caught in a storm might require crafting a makeshift shelter and a fire to wait it out for a while. The landscape has a few waterways and gigantic stone faces that block off easy path-taking, but periodically you'll find bridges left still standing to cross to another section of the map. The wildlife ranges from skittish to hostile, particularly dependent upon what game mode you've selected. In Wanderer mode, we can get into short range without even getting their attention. Deer, rabbits, and foxes will run off, but animals like the moose, wolves, or bears will give chase and might just leave you with severe injuries. In the more difficult mode, the animals hunt you, or if you get within their sight range, they might have already seen you as well, and perhaps you want to get a weapon ready. This can happen entirely by self-defense or because you're intentionally hunting for supplies, as animals drop meat, bones, and pelts. Many items are also available in the crafting tool menu, from bone knives to spears or a bow with arrows, but you'll notice as you loot the story-related areas, there's quite a few boxes of bullets. And these aren't useless, but you've got to find the rifle first. This could land early or late opening up your map depending upon where you started. I'm not sure if there's more than one, but so far I picked up one firearm in the gulag. This could be helpful if you decide that you're going to take on some bears. I've been mostly taking on boars because they're not too difficult. If you just keep backing up and poking at them with the spear simultaneously, they fall over dead in a couple hits. And you can get away without even having an abrasion to bandage. There are main paths and roads, however one might see those, running through these zones that do act as a sort of guide between the different points of interest. There's even occasional signs indicating what's ahead at the outposts. Along the way, there's resources everywhere. Sticks and stones are in abundance on the ground. Larger pieces of wood logs must be cut from trees using the hatchet. Some trees may also be hiding bird nests, which can be harvested for eggs, feathers, and the nest itself, which I believe can be used for fire or tinder. Kind of rude, but gotta survive. Already dead birds can be found lying face first in the snow, and using a quickly crafted stick dagger we can harvest some drumsticks off the carcass along with a few feathers. Broken decayed trees may have sap dripping from them that can be collected, useful for bandage dressings and also to get the tinder on your fires started. Mushrooms! Mushrooms everywhere, on the ground, on trees. Several varieties pop up right away, and I'm fairly sure that most of the brightly colored ones are poisonous, but that dark shaded one with the flattened top is safe to consume, providing a meager 3 hunger and 3 energy, but they'll get you by for a while. Other species of flora crop up in this snowy world. Wildflowers could offer a benefit or present a threat. I did notice when the NPC came across some berries that he had seen eaten by rabbits, he decided that they were good enough for us too in the voice prompt. Others he suspects are poisonous, and so far I'm following along with that and potentially just have to experiment with other herbs and fungus, but finding specific books to research along the way can fill the guidebook so that we'll know for sure. This brings me to a little segment on early cooking and crafting basics that I noticed along my journey. Inside your guidebook, along the right side tabs, we will first need to craft a fire of sorts. If we have a fireplace or a wood-burning stove, then a fuel source is usually already there and it only requires a source of tinder along with a starting action like using rocks or a lighter or matches. Fires from scratch will need some sticks or also stones if you're going with the full camping setup. Careful not to walk too close. Fires can cause burns which will stack up afflictions with infection risk. Large meat can be added directly to these fires once built, but some items such as eggs require using additional gear to be added first. Cook pots can be looted from abandoned quest areas to help you cook all those raw eggs in addition to melting water to keep your thirst meter up. Hot meals seem to be quite effective in raising your sanity levels back up. The comfort foods might be worth cooking from time to time. These sardine cans probably aren't a favorite snack, but there's actually quite a variety laying around all these camps. There's some chicken noodle soup, teriyaki and rice, and gotta grab this orange soda for the road. And don't forget to check vehicles for all the sodas they left behind. According to the tooltip, it's possible to combine ingredients together in the wild. Large cook pots will allow you to do some more gourmet level soup. Cooking also provides the means to concoct treatments for afflictions like fever or dysentery through boiling snow together with herbs or mushrooms with the correct recipes. And the detail in this game is quite elaborate here. In the last tab of the crafting section is also the drying rack for meats among some other useful containers for excess gathered material. I'm thinking this means that we're supposed to start a makeshift base somewhere. Just need some foundations, walls, entrances, and decorations would be nice. When I was browsing the Steam discussions, I came across a thread where developers mentioned base building may eventually be added to the game, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Quite often there's considerable issues with a second or two of a complete lag freeze, but sometimes with that interesting motion effect included, and while it's not killing the game for me, I sure hope that does not get me killed when I start game modes that involve animals that are a lot more aggressive. Well, hopefully they can get that worked out in the future, but I do feel like this game has been significantly overlooked in a vast market of Steam survival game genre. This happens all too often to small studios. I see this game repeatedly being compared to something called The Long Dark, and I'm unfamiliar with this title, but maybe that relates anything to others. I just know that so far Northern Lights has been engaging and encouraging to play, even if I'm having to wander around a lot to find this fuel canister. It's exploration time with an opportunity to expand on the skills that the game has to offer. The game mode I started in has more than adequate resources to keep my stats maxed out. Not sure if all the food inside homes are supposed to respawn every time I log in or if that's just a bug, but it makes the easy mode survival while I learn. And I'm not really complaining because it's just a nice way to learn what all there is to do in this game that actually does have a ton to manage. We have to keep an eye on sanity mechanics with the addition of the cabin fever and the affliction. It's a game that's actually considered how hazardous humans are to themselves with their own brain. Cabin fever is an affliction that only comes into play when choosing the more difficult game modes and will force you out of enclosed spaces into bad weather, otherwise risk ticking away at your sanity. Running out into the blizzard isn't much better of an alternative, so the hard mode really is quite hard. If we were in the Arctic, it would be something to this effect.
It's just like a white desert. For as far as you can see, there is absolutely nothing. And you come back and it's overwhelming.
Between 2016 and 2018, Dr. Tim Heitland spent 14 months in Antarctica as part of a 12-person German research team. When he returned to regular life, things felt different.
The first thing I did was like hugged a tree.
Being away from the icy continent felt normal after a few days. But one thing still didn't feel right: being surrounded by people.
That was a feeling that lasted for a long time, really long, easily more than a year.
Throughout Heitland's journey, a team of researchers studied the doctor and his colleagues to pinpoint the effects of long-term isolation. Their most striking finding was that nearly all of the explorers' brains physically changed. Isolation has profound effects on us. Scientists are only beginning to understand the full scope of these changes, and they're doing cutting-edge research to discover if and how we can overcome them. Because although humans didn't evolve to live in isolation, many of us are beginning to spend more and more time alone, and that could be a big problem. Being in Antarctica is very different from normal life.
You get a lot of hurricane force storms, and in the beginning it frightens you. People, like in our first storm, we've been sitting in the station and sometimes it starts to shake. And then it's a place of total, absolute silence.
Living in such a stark environment profoundly alters the brain. Over the course of 14 months, most of Heitland's crew lost volume in part of the hippocampus, a region involved in spatial navigation, learning, and emotional processing.
This is especially for us interesting because this has something to do with your memory. We do not know for the moment what is lost there.
Dr. Hans Christian Gunga was one of the researchers leading the study. Although his team's data doesn't show exactly what faculties the expeditioners lost, they found changes similar to what you'd expect to see in patients with depression or Alzheimer's disease. It was so significant that Gunga wondered if they'd made a mistake.
When you compare that to the post-traumatic stress syndrome, they have sometimes not so strong changes as these guys they're down in Antarctica.
These kinds of neurological changes can have major effects on behavior. In 2018, shortly after Heitland returned from his 14-month mission, another Antarctic expeditioner stabbed one of his crewmates, who was annoying him by spoiling the endings to books.
A spoiler alert almost turned deadly.
The problem isn't Antarctica, but isolation. In February, a group of researchers published an analysis of more than 3,000 studies on the psychological effects of quarantine. They found extremely high rates of PTSD among people who'd previously been quarantined, whether for SARS or equine influenza. Solitary confinement also leads to high prevalence of PTSD and depression. These trauma-related disorders strongly suggest underlying brain damage, and the latest animal research shows the damage extends far beyond the hippocampus.
I became really interested in social isolation because I was kind of drawn to increases in violence that seem to be occurring more in our society.
Dr. Muriel Zelikowski studies the science of fear and aggression.
Really, one of the ways you get this huge increase in violence is having these increases in social isolation. That's kind of true across a variety of species.
While doing her postdoctoral research at Caltech, Zelikowski and her team isolated mice for 2 weeks and then studied changes in their behavior and brain function. They focused their study on a specific molecule called TAC2 that triggers stress response.
The goal is to really tie this increase in TAC2 to functional changes in behavior related to social isolation.
When an animal is exposed to stress, TAC2, and potentially a host of additional molecules, signal a stress response across the brain. So when the mice are kept in isolation and the stress persists, the animals start acting skittish and aggressive. When Zelikowski's team started looking at mouse brains, they expected to find elevated levels of TAC2 in specific parts of the brain, like the amygdala, which handles fear. Instead, they found TAC2 in numerous regions across the brain. When they tagged the molecule with a green fluorescent compound, the effect was so dramatic, you could see it without a microscope.
Unlike a single traumatic event or some memory being stored in a particular part of the brain, What seemed to happen with isolation is many different parts of the brain were affected, some of which weren't even really connected to each other.
Zelikowski and her team believe some of those clusters of elevated TAC2 explain extremely abnormal behaviors that persist after isolation, like irrational fears and violent behavior. They did find proactive ways to make the isolation less damaging and reverse its effects, but it's hard, if not impossible, to re-socialize mice once they've been isolated, because they're so violent. All of this paints a pretty grim picture of isolation, but some experts argue that's missing a huge part of the story, because many people say confinement experiences change their lives for the better.
There you are.
This is Jack Stuster, an anthropologist who spent decades helping NASA make life in space more livable. In 2003, he began the longest-running experiment on the International Space Station, analyzing confidential journals astronauts kept while in space. Stuster says the journals provide unique insight into the minds of astronauts and the many changes they experience while in orbit.
In some cases, I learned more than I really wanted to know. I mean, someone going through marriage problems or others who had a difficult time on orbit with relations with mission control, for example, or problems at home.
Many of these problems would seem minor if they weren't magnified by the effects of isolation and the stress it applies to different regions of the brain.
You know, in isolation and confinement, one of these things that happens is trivial issues are exaggerated. Little things are blown out of proportion.
And yet, Stuster says astronauts and other expeditioners don't end up permanently damaged. He says he's been amazed time and time again how well astronauts adapt to space and then back to life at home.
Every one of them who I have met has been exceptional in important ways. And one of those ways is that they're resilient.
It's important to recognize that resilience is something astronauts are pre-selected for, and they still have to work hard at it. One of the astronauts Stuster has studied is Mike Fink, one of NASA's most veteran space flyers, flying on 3 missions for a total of 381 days in orbit.
As soon as we land, we want everything to be the way it was before, and that just doesn't work.
Most of the astronaut reintegration process is designed to address the pain of returning from low Earth orbit.
We meet with a physical trainer and they work us out, the heck out of us, so that our muscles and bones come back.
But NASA also has a family support team to help astronauts anticipate some of the interpersonal and emotional challenges of returning. Because after a long time away, even minor changes can be jarring.
For example, my wife was in charge and then I came back and I didn't immediately say, no, I'm in charge now. No, that wasn't going to work. I'd be really tired at the end of the day and my wife said, hey, time to take out the trash. It's like, well, I guess I'm back.
Getting back to a normal routine is important for reuniting with family and friends. It also has lots of important health implications. Recent studies suggest the hippocampus is surprisingly resilient, given sufficient exercise combined with a diet rich in antioxidants. Sleep is also incredibly helpful, particularly REM sleep, when researchers believe the hippocampus is forming memories. Meanwhile, researchers like Muriel Zelikowski are exploring possible drug treatments that could protect the brain from isolation-induced damage. Their interventions have shown promising results in mice, though they're still a long way from having something they could bring to humans. Which leaves most experts recommending, at least for now, that people in isolation try to frame it as an opportunity and grow from experiencing a new perspective.
It reduces your social relationships totally to the core of communicating, of getting to know each other, taking care of each other, and trying to have the best possible time together. And I think that is totally valuable.
A 2018 study on researchers in Antarctica sought to measure the impacts of prolonged exposure of extreme winter environments on people's well-being. The idea was to monitor the coping strategies of researchers at the Concordia station for a 10-month period. They noted, participants became more indifferent or emotionally flat during the winter months. This interpretation is consistent with early research which noted the occurrence of mild psychological fugue state known as the Antarctic stare. The phenomenon state is characterized by an altered state of consciousness or pronounced absent-mindedness, drifting, wandering off attention, and deterioration in situational awareness. The state of seeking reduced stimulation and emotional flatness bears resemblance to what could be called psychological hibernation. A state of psychological hibernation may be beneficial for coping with the harshness of prolonged exposure to stress in extreme environments. They go on to measure how this ability to switch off is beneficial in the modern world, especially if you work at a corporate job or experience some other form of chronic stress. This wouldn't typically get you killed in day-to-day suburbia, but it could if you were stuck on an island in Siberia. The more uncertain the situation, the less resources available, the more difficult the burden on the brain becomes. In Northern Lights, you'll find yourself having to deal with plenty of stressors, from being rushed by a flock of bats, to feeling guilty for killing an animal, or just generally feeling grumpy from substantial fatigue from your stats. A nice warm fire, some snacks and rest will help you recover that sanity meter. You know, any of the things that might make one feel good. And I really love this well thought out mechanic to manage our emotional resilience. I feel like for its few shortcomings, Northern Lights is actually a pretty good game, and it's not entirely finished in its content, but it's getting there. It just needs a little polish here and there. Devs have posted a roadmap for the future of the title, and recent addition of story mode helps to create a lot more purpose for running around in this harsh terrain. The roadmap includes multiplayer mode, and Trustworthy has already expressed interest, so even if I do manage to find everything in this massive map before that, I'm happy to play it over again. As I've read, when starting a new game save, the player's dropped into a different part of the map, which creates a slightly different experience when on survival mode. Well, I like it. I'm 10 plus hours in already and nowhere near done from what I can see. I'm not bored and I'm not frustrated yet, but I probably could be if I swapped out for a harder mode. As I had to hobble to a point of interest with a twisted ankle and got an abrasion after taking too big of a leap from a cliff. When I stopped to nap, I got the flu in the middle of sleeping, so here I am with this giant list of afflictions down to a fever and infection risk, and you can get yourself into tricky situations really quick, especially if you're not paying attention to wildlife that may think you're food. It only took me about an hour to die while stepping up the difficulty, so there's definitely a range here for players from chill to absolutely insane. So I'm definitely revisiting this game, and I'll start a playlist for it because there's just a whole lot more here to talk about besides the basics of survival. The Sanity and Affliction mechanic alone warrants its own video because this game is so utterly cool with the implementation. How it's lost or regained is actually quite realistic too, what might also have an effect on our brains in real life. If you're curious about that, or the cognitive science involved, stick around, maybe hit the sub button if you want notifications. I'm gonna go experiment some more with how to drive myself crazy in this game, literally, so I can thoroughly cover the topic in the next video. I'm totally gonna have fun doing it, don't worry. Take care, y'all, and bye-bye!